I'm Robert Plomin. I'm a professor of genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, which is here in London. It's part of King's College London.
Okay.
And I've been here about 30 years now.
So you're a psychologist and a genetician? Yeah. Your studies in the past 50 years has been mainly about innate and acquired?
People do use the word innate, and that tends to be, implies programmed, deterministic, hardwired.
I want to believe that, with willpower, I can do anything.
So it isn't just a matter of finding out, what you're good at, but you got to find out what you like to do.
Even though there is 99% of our DNA that is the same, this 1% different makes the whole difference.
Well, those are the differences we're studying.
Yeah.
We're asking, why are people different? When I say things are substantially genetically influenced, it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. It's probabilistic. It means other things being equal, you're more likely to be like this than other people.
Robert, I'm thrilled to have you on this podcast. I had the chance to record with a friend of mine called Antoine Frère. And Antoine is one of the greatest French entrepreneurs I've received on my podcast twice. And Antoine, actually, during our episode, talked about your studies, and he mentioned your name, Robert Plomin. And I just wrote down the name, sent it to Clémence, my producer here, and just I was thinking, you know what, I have to do something with that. So one of the theses of Génération, do it yourself, this podcast you're here, is actually we are the average of the people we hang out with, right? So I was thinking. The idea is that I will be better if I hang out with better people, right? And so the idea, probably underneath this thesis, is that if we can grow during our journey on Earth, right? Probably. And your studies in the past 50 years has been mainly about innate and acquired, but we were about to say nurture and nature and nurture. Is that it, right?
Yes.
And it's a bit different.
It is.
It is.
Do you want to go into that now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, people do use the word innate, and that tends to be, implies programmed, deterministic, hardwired things. Like, usually at a species level in evolution, we say, man walks on two legs. That's sort of innate because almost everyone can walk on two legs.
Okay.
And we have frontal vision. Those things that have been so important for our evolutionary history that there's no variation that's allowed. So, it's hardwired. Man is a natural language user. Kids will pick up language naturally, given the normal environment. You lock them in a closet and they won't learn a language. But so innate has that deterministic character, and that's something that we fight against because there are thousands of genes that are single gene mutations, like Huntington's disease. I don't know if people have heard about that. Woody Guthrie died from Huntington's disease. It's a single gene mutation on chromosome 4. We have 23 chromosomes. And if you get that mutation, you will die from Huntington's in middle age, unless something else kills you.
And it was programmed since you're born.
Well, the DNA you inherit in the single cell with which you begin life, with half of the chromosomes from your mother, half from your father, that DNA is the same DNA in every one of the trillions of cells in your body. So that mutation for Huntington's, you would have inherited from one of your parents, or it could be a spontaneous mutation, but it's almost always inherited.
Right.
And if you get that gene, it is deterministic and hardwired. So most people learn about genetics from Mendel. People would know who Mendel is, I presume, who worked with the pea plants in the mid-19th century.
Mendel.
And he discovered the laws of heredity. And he was working with single gene disorders in pea plants. So, peas, edible peas, have have seeds that have smooth skins.
Yeah.
He found a mutation that makes them have wrinkled skins. And those are hardwired and deterministic. You can't change it environmentally or anything. The problem is everybody learns about genetics from that, from single gene, usually disorders, that are hardwired and deterministic. But what we're talking about with complex traits and common disorders, like 95% of the medical burden for heart disease and diabetes, those sorts of things, they're genetic, they're substantially genetic, but they're not due to a single gene.
Okay.
And that means they become probabilistic rather than deterministic. And it's not just semantic, it's an important distinction. Because when I say things are substantially genetically influenced, it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. It's probabilistic. It means other things being equal, you're more likely to be like this than other people.
You're more likely. It will not happen for sure, but
probability. Yes.
And out of those probabilities, can you get percentages sometimes every time? Yeah, out of studies, I believe. Or
yes, that's for the last 20 years. There's been the DNA revolution, where instead of just saying things are influenced genetically, like twin studies that you mentioned, or adoption studies, or identical twins reared apart. That's how we knew genetics is very important. The revolution now is to actually identify sequences of DNA, the 3 billion base pairs of DNA that we have in the spiral staircase of DNA. We can find those steps, those mutations, those DNA differences that we inherit at birth, and put them together, put thousands of them together to predict, in my case, behavior. Like one of the strongest ones that we've worked on is for school achievement, how well kids do at school.
Okay.
And we can predict 15% of the variance, that is, of the differences between kids in their school leaving scores. We have these national exams here in England, and 15% of the differences between children can be predicted with DNA alone. And that means you can predict it at birth because DNA doesn't change during life. Now, that's a long way from 100%. But school achievement is about 60% heritable from twin and adoption studies.
60%?
60%, which is a lot. And so we're explaining, say, 15% of 60%. And so we still have a way to go. But when people say, it's only 15%, they don't understand that with complex diseases or things like obesity and alcoholism or educational achievement, try to find something else that explains 5% of the variance. And a good case in point is in England, unlike, I think, Europe and France particularly, we have this very test-crazy system, not as bad as the Chinese, but pretty bad, where to get into the best secondary schools, you have to do well on these exams.
Yeah.
And people spend enormous amounts of money getting their kids into the best schools, so that they have the best chance of getting into the best secondary schools, so they have the best chance of getting into Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah.
Well, if you ask, we also have these very expensive ratings of schools. So we have these independent examiners who go to all these schools and rate them for 2 days on everything, interview the kids. You can't get better ratings of the school quality. So how much of the variance in these school leaving exams can be explained by the quality of the school kids go to? And the answer is 4%. So with DNA, we're already explaining almost 4 times as much variance as you can by knowing which school the kids went to, the quality of the schools, which is amazing because people will spend hundreds of thousands of pounds getting their kids into the best schools, and it doesn't make a difference.
It's crazy. And I mean, that raises a lot of questions that we will go into. Definitely, because you've been thinking about that for a long time, including probably, should we test those kids and see? I mean, what's quite interesting is that school is a recent model, right? It's like, 200 years old? Mm-hmm. Something like that. Mm-hmm. So probably we can adapt schools to different DNAs, maybe? That's a question that will come. But before that, because we dove already into the into this episode. Would you introduce yourself, Robert?
Yes, I would. So I'm Robert Plomin. I'm a professor of genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, which is here in London. It's part of King's College London.
Okay.
And I've been here about 30 years now. I grew up in the States, in Chicago, and then, as many people do in the U.S., they travel around. So I did my graduate school at Texas, and then I had my first job at Colorado, and then I took another job at Penn State, and then I decided to move to England.
How comes?
Cherchez la femme.
All right.
So I was married several times, and the wife at that time was English, and we had met while she was on a sabbatical in the States. And so she tried living in the States, but, really didn't like it for reasons we could go into. And her whole family was here.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent our summers in England, and I eventually had more friends in England than I did in the States. Plus, it's part of Europe.
Yeah.
Less than it used to be, I suppose,
It used to
with
be.
Brexit. But other than that, it's still great, hopping on the Eurostar. And
It's true.
I'd take our research team to Paris for lunch. We'd meet on the train, and then we'd have a lovely lunch. People would wander around Paris, and then we'd go home on the train together and meet some more.
Cool.
Fantastic.
Are you British?
I have a British citizenship now, but I've been American until about 5 years ago.
Okay. So you're not American anymore?
I tried to give up my passport, but
How
you
comes?
can't do it.
Oh, yeah, but maybe for tax reasons.
Exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It would have cost me £300,000 to stop being an American.
No way.
Because they claim tax on all my pensions for the future. I think it's really scandalous. I pay more in tax every year to have my tax return filled out for the United States than the money I get from the States. I never go to the States. I don't use any of their resources. I think if any other country tried to do that, people would be up in arms about it. I don't understand why people just accept this. Because, the U.S., if you have a U.S. passport, if you're a U.S. citizen, they take first crack at all of your income, worldwide income. And then if English taxes are more. So then the English take more tax.
No way.
It's just, I can't understand how they get away with it.
It's true. They're Americans.
I'm very anti-American now.
Are you? So yeah, the study of your life has been around. So you're a psychologist and a genetician. Yeah.
Yes.
How close are those, or were those practices when you started? Because psyche sounds more like something you cannot really, touch. I mean, you cannot, and genetics is much more tangible, right?
Yes. Well, it's a very good question, because when I went to graduate school at Texas at Austin, I went into the psychology department. They have a good psychology department, but unknown to me, they were the only place in the world that had a course in genetics. Mm-hmm. There was no other psychology department in the world that taught anything about genetics. As an undergraduate, I never heard the word genetics. Psychology in the 40s and 50s, after the Second World War and Nazi Germany and eugenics, it wasn't anti-genetics. They just erased genetics. You don't read anything about genetics. And the problem with that is it became environmentalistic. It assumed everything that you are is environmentally caused.
Do you have do you mind if I ask if you have a Jew background, or no?
A what?
A Jew? Are you
a Jewish?
Yeah, Jewish. Sorry.
No.
I thought you were. But because you had a that's the problem. I understand. So the problem was that you would have a better race. That's what. So the genes was a problem at that time, right? Was that the reason?
Well, yes. I mean, it goes back to the early 1900s when many intellectuals were talking about genetics and eugenics, the idea that you can breed people like you breed animals. Because if there's genetic influence, you could actually breed for it. But then, with Nazi Germany, and apparently the English philosophy types who were talking about eugenics, not convinced, but they led the people, the Nazis who tried to push eugenics. It really did encourage them to think about not eugenics, the EU means good. But of course, the Nazis were interested in exterminating people. And I really think they hated Jews so much, they were using this as a, do you know the phrase, fig leaf? They would have done it anyway. But they used eugenics. They were going to purify the Aryan race, is what they were talking about. So that was so abhorrent to everybody that you couldn't talk about genetics anymore.
So when you started in Houston, was in what, 65 around?
1970, I started graduate school, in Texas.
1970. So it was, like 25 years after the end of the war. And it was still the very beginning of genetics, because I mean, if I understand well, even in the past 20 years, genetics have made amazing progress, right?
Yes. Okay. But you're right. When I started graduate school in the 1970s, I was an undergraduate in Chicago, and I never heard the word in psychology, never heard the word genetics.
Okay.
And when I started graduate school, this was the only place in the world that actually had a course in genetics. And this is where chance, I think, is a big factor in life, and we can probably talk some more about it. It isn't just philosophical. I think there are scientific reasons for talking about randomness. And this is a good example of that. I went to Texas because it was a good graduate school, and also being a poor inner city Chicago kid where nobody went to university, they offered to pay me to go there. So that sounded like a pretty good scam, so I thought I would do that. But then I took this course with 40 other students. They had these core courses where all the first-year students had to take the same courses together across the board in psychology: perception, cognition, clinical, personality, and in this case, this genetics course.
Interesting.
And what the chance comes in that I didn't know that was there, and when I took it, it completely floored me. I mean, I was so blown away by it, because I'd never heard about genetics. And here's this evidence, mostly from animal studies at the time, showing how powerful genetics is in behavior. But the weird thing is, 39 other students were in that class. Not one of them became interested in genetics. So what is that about? Because I knew that's what I wanted to do. And it's such a blessing, if you can find something that really grabs you,
I can completely understand, why you've been interested in genetics, but I can also really completely understand why most of students in psychology wouldn't be. I mean, it's not probably what you would be looking for. You know what I'm saying? You would be more looking for into the, I don't know, excuse my French, but read the mind, right?
Yeah.
It would be more about not so concrete things. Maybe it has changed, but it's the perception I have, no?
Well, that had changed quite a bit by then. It was actually in the 1920s that psychology moved away from navel gazing, and, sort of philosophical approaches to empirical approaches, which were pretty hardcore scientific and perception, neuroscience, those were very rigorous types of science. So I think things had changed to that extent, but people still weren't willing to talk about genetics, I think. And that's part of the reasons why other people might not have taken it up. You had to be pretty tough to do that because it was dangerous to even talk about genetics. Dangerous professionally and even personally. There were incidents where people had to have protection and that sort of thing because people got very upset about it.
I told you about Antoine, who actually told me about you when we recorded, and when I've sent a message to him this afternoon, he said, "Careful on the subject. People might be deeply moved by what you're going to say." So it's interesting. You still have, in 2023, we still have warnings on this. It wasn't. I think he's very happy. He said, "Oh, wow, that's so cool." Sure. But you still feel that today?
Yeah, I gave a talk in Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, up north from here, and in the autumn. And Cambridge is weird in terms of these issues of cancellation and the culture wars and that sort of thing. And someone had declared my talking there as dangerous. And when they do that, then you have to pre-enroll with picture ID and register to hear me talk. And then when you go to hear me talk, you have to show that ID. They had guards, and there wasn't any problem. I mean, there weren't any placards. I don't know why. I've never been canceled or had any serious problems. And I don't quite know why that is. I think something that would be nice to talk about is I've heard that in France, people are still more resistant to the idea of genetics than they are even in countries like Germany, which you'd think from their history might be very wary of talking about genetics. But, in terms of these companies that sequence your DNA to give you these genetic profiles and medical risk indicators, 27 million people in the world have paid to do this. I think you're not allowed to do it.
We're not
France.
allowed. No, we're not. It's they're doing it, which is weird actually. Somehow there are some public researches on what you call DNA, tumoral DNA, for cancers, to find out cancers. So this
tumor DNA.
Yeah. So they're doing a lot of public researches, but French people are not comfortable with private companies having your DNA data, and I kind of I have mixed feeling about that. But at some point, it's true. I don't know if it's the big picture. Are we not comfortable? And that's also why I'm so excited to have you today.
What do you think about this hypothesis? This is probably maybe a little too nasty, but a lot of the data involves getting parent and offspring DNA. You can do a lot more. You get a lot more power by having parents as well as kids. And it's said among the scientists that one of the reasons the French don't want to get into this is because of 5-7.
Yeah, probably. It could be a reason. I've read somewhere, I don't know if it's just in France, but I think if you have I have 3 childs. I don't think this study is funny. 3 children, sorry. I don't know if I should laugh about this story, but the third one, there is in France at least, I would say, one a chance out of 3 that it's not mine, right? So... fortunately, I mean, mine is blonde with blue eyes, and my wife is not blonde, and I'm not blonde, and I don't have blue eyes, and I'm kind of But actually, he's got my face, so I want to believe he's mine. But yeah, that's probably that could be a reason. I believe also probably I don't know. Somehow, what we're going to talk about and what you've been studying and what you said about school makes me uncomfortable and sad, probably. I don't know. I want to believe that, with willpower, I can do anything. Yeah. I want to believe, or I believe at some point that, I mean, there aren't that many differences between, sorry for the reference, but me and Einstein, or me and Steve Jobs. And it's just if you work more and work and get inspired and get creative and hang out with the right people, maybe at some point you will discover amazing things. And to my understanding, that far in our discussion is that, well, I mean, even though there is isn't it right, 99% of our DNA that is the same, this 1% different makes the whole difference.
Well, those are the differences we're studying.
Yeah.
We're asking, why are people different? And the line you gave about, work hard enough, anyone can be anything they want to be. That isn't true, right? At some level.
At some level, probably. I mean, I know I cannot be a professional NBA player. I mean, for example. But yeah, in my mind, and I know or I understand that some people are naturally more, have more chances to be depressed. Do you confirm? I believe, yeah. So I believe, but do people? Some people have more reasons or probabilities to be smart, have a good memory, creative. I mean, all of these fields are written.
We've gone from the 1970s, when I started graduate school, where people didn't consider genetics, to realizing now that you can't find anything in psychology that does not show significant genetic influence. And it's pretty substantial genetic influence, including cognitive abilities. So if you think of things like spatial ability, you know, people will tell you, yeah, I'm really good at spatial ability. Like I'm not comfortable in a new place unless I know which way north is, for example. I've got to, I'm a pilot, partly that's it, and I see the Rosetta, and I've got to know where north. I'm surprised at people who, they don't have any spatial ability. They say, I go down to one street and then I turn left and I go to the next street. So people will tell you that they differ in spatial ability. They'll certainly tell you they differ in mathematical ability. And the problem is, with what you were saying, is that anybody can be better at something. Like you could be very good at math. You know, we could really focus on math, bring in people who could really teach you math. But, you know, you probably would admit you'd probably not end up getting a Nobel Prize in math. But you could be much better at math. So that's the difference. Genetic influence doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. And that's the worst case. And the worst case to deal with is cognitive abilities, because that is so kind of almost pejorative and, you know, and so important to people probably. You know, like in mate selection, the intelligence is the number one thing.
In what? In
mating. When, you know, you pick someone to live with. So if you move away from that area, where this is going to happen first is with medicine. There are several countries already, and England is moving this way. It has an £80 million pilot project now to get DNA from anyone who goes in a hospital.
Compulsory or voluntary?
Voluntary.
Okay.
But in Finland and Estonia, where they do it, 85% of the people want to do it. If they take your blood, they say, would you like us to do DNA testing? And people say yes, because medicine is moving away from waiting until people have a heart attack and then trying to fix it to trying to prevent it.
Of course, sure, definitely.
And the best to prevent, you have to predict. And the best predictor around is DNA. So we can now, with DNA, predict that there's, say, 10%, it's 5% of men walking around are at like a 10-fold greater risk of having a heart attack. And if you were one of those guys, wouldn't you want to know about it?
I definitely would. I mean, I wear this tracker, like I track everything I do, like all day long, and I'm interested in all of those data.
Yeah.
And I would actually, love to get that done, probably.
Yeah, because there's things you can do about it. Do you know, if at the lowest level, these are low-tech solutions. You can say, if you knew you were at a 10-fold greater risk of having one of these severe heart attacks in midlife, you'd just pay attention to what the messages we all get from public health. You know, eat better, sleep more, you know, that sort of thing. But if you're at risk, you'd say, okay, well, I better do that. I better lose a little weight and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you can go to higher levels, including body scans, so that you can detect fuzzy arteries before they occlude and cause a heart attack. So it just is a no-brainer that medicine is going to move to a preventative medicine.
And all of these you're talking about, I definitely buy it. And I buy the rest. I'm not saying I don't buy it, but what I'm saying, what I'm saying is that it's once again tangible. It's something that we're talking about vessels, veins. I mean, you know, the body parts, right? Yeah. Can we determine now, today, in 2023, if someone, thanks to his DNA, her DNA, is or probably can be good at math?
Well, right now we can predict general school achievement.
Okay.
And these studies to determine these genes require millions of people. Yeah. So the one that allows us to predict 15% of the variance in school achievement, there were 3 million people in that study. And the reason for that is that we're not talking about detecting a handful of genes. We're talking about thousands of genes, each with very tiny effects. And if you know anything about statistics, you know that to detect these little effects, you need great statistical power. You need very large samples to detect them.
And that's where AI will just change everything.
it's going to change everything
within like the next year or a couple of years.
And isn't it fascinating, that we always thought it would take automation would take out all the lower level sorts of jobs, but it's clear AI is going to start from the top.
My God.
We use it. If you want to do a script, to analyze data, it's amazing. You just say, here's what you want to do. It comes up with the script. It checks the script you've been using and shows you a better one.
I mean, you take like those 3 million dudes, you put their grades at school, you say, look at their grades, you put their DNA and you say, just find something, right? It will find something at some point.
It will. And there's a deeper aspect to that. Right now, we're just looking for the additive effects of each of these genes. Mm-hmm. Because that's difficult enough if you've got 3 billion base pairs of DNA, and we're typically dealing with a few million DNA differences between people. And so we're looking at those that are more associated with the trait, like school achievement, and we're adding them up. That's an additive model. It looks at each DNA difference in itself and adds it to the next one. But you could say, but they probably don't work independently. Yeah. They probably interact with each other. But it just very quickly becomes much too difficult for anyone to work out. But AI can definitely do that.
That will be amazing.
But which will make it all more predictive. I mean, it's amazing that we're able to predict as much as we are, given that we're only dealing with additive effects.
The thing is that it's so deep. I mean, because what you've been working on is just analyzing what happens, right? The coherence or incoherences between DNA and the psyche, right? Mm-hmm. But did you think, or do you work on yourself or with other people of what will we do with all that? Because at the end, I get my kids a DNA test just to know if they're going to have some heart disease or, the probability that they have some problems at some point. I'm happy with that. But if it tells me Jules is going to be, so bad at school, I'm going to be like, what can I do with that?
Yeah. Well, there's a question as to how much information you'll get. Like if the government's collecting DNA through the hospitals, like our National Health Service, there's a real debate as to how much information they should give you. There's another side to it. So the idea now is they'll give you actionable information.
Yeah, but sorry. You said you want it to be a discussion, so I stop you here.
Sure.
How much information they will give you. So, I mean, it's not even the information they have. It's that's where I'm taking my French part again and saying, you give it to a government or a private, and maybe someone has information about you. They don't give it to you because they don't want to tell you, hey, right. Sorry, mate, you're going to be just bad at school. So,
yeah. But the other side of that...
We shouldn't pay for university for you because, it's not going to work.
Well, we should talk about that. But the first step is to say, it's your DNA. So there's a counter argument here saying, it's my DNA. I ought to be able to have as much information as I want, which is why a lot of people are doing it themselves. 27 million people around the world. They're paying about 100 euros to get this information. Yeah. And it's a lot of valuable information, things that can be life-saving, actually. But there's one, say, that's really tricky. What about Alzheimer's? I can predict, with DNA, I can tell if you're in this lucky 1% of the population that has like a 65-70% risk of having Alzheimer's when you get old.
That's just 1%. I would have thought it would be much, much more.
No, it's 1% of the population who has this risk because they have particular genes.
Okay.
So at 80, over 10% of the population is starting to show signs of
Alzheimer's.
Dementia. Alzheimer's. Yeah. But this 1%, not a 10% risk, they have over a 60% risk, which in medical terms, it's not 100%, but that's huge.
That's
right?
huge.
So when I do a public lecture, I ask people, would you want to know? Because if you just do one of these direct-to-consumer DNA company tests like 23andMe, they'll provide that information, but there's a triple lock. You have to say, yes, I understand this might be uncomfortable, and then they said, here's some reading material. Have you read this material? And then it says, do you still want to know? And so I ask people, would you want to know? Like, would you want to know?
Yeah, I wouldn't even read those things. I would check the boxes and say, I want to know, I want to know, I want to know.
You would?
Yeah, definitely.
But see, doesn't that contradict what you said before?
Yeah, I don't know. I would want to know.
Well, I find that half, and the people I give public lectures to, they're probably university educated.
But you know what? Sorry, Robert. Maybe I wouldn't have, I don't know, when I was 15 or 20. I mean, because for some reason, that might be DNA related or not. I believe not. I don't know. Maybe just luck. But things are going well for me. So I'm just thinking, you know what? I mean, I have great people around me. I'm having fun. I have the kind of life I want to have, right? So, I mean, even if this tells me you're just a dumbass and you're just, I would say, okay, right, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I can live with that. But if it tells me you should be careful on your heart, your weight, your smoking, drinking, whatever it is, then I think at my midlife age time, I think it would be worth it. But maybe what I'm saying when I was 15, it would probably be more of a trauma. Maybe it would have maybe told me things that I wouldn't want to hear, because it would have maybe made me stop dreaming about some things. I wanted to be a Formula One world champion, which I'm not, but it's okay. But maybe it would have told me you will never be that. Right?
Yeah,
and I think it's okay.
Well, it's
true. Good to be able to dream about that, right?
Yeah, young people are stupid, aren't they? In a way, they just think they're invincible. They think I'm going to live forever. They have a long life ahead. But actually, when you ask these people, well, half of the people that I say no. They don't want the information about dementia, and half say yes. And if you ask the ones like you who say yes, and me, it's because knowledge is power. I just want to know about myself. And the ones who say no, they say no, because there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing yet to prevent it. Although these new drugs that have just come out this last...
Alzheimer, yeah. For Alzheimer, you're right.
This last year. But I think that there is something you can do about it. I mean, if you knew you were at that tremendous risk, medically, 60%, not 100%, but 60% risk. There are things you can do. You can't cure it. But what you can do is you can prepare for it. You can set up your life so that you'll have social support, economic support. You'll be okay when you get older.
You prepare your kids. Yeah.
And I think carpe diem, a lot of people say. Like a lot of my friends who have heart attacks, they say it's the best thing that ever happened to them, because they kind of reevaluated their life and they said, I'm going to live more for today. I'm not going to just have these long-term goals, because my life's going to go by in the meantime, And so I think even with something as difficult as dementia, people want to know. You keep coming back to intelligence. And that is, as I said, the hardest one, because it's so personal, isn't it? I mean, people like us think that that's a large part of who we are, how intelligent we are. But it's important to recognize, you say you have 3 children.
Yep.
Well, there's a neat saying in genetics that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. Because with the first child, anything that she is, say if she's shy, you can always come up with an environmental reason why she's shy. And if you ask parents, why is your child shy?
It's always because of my wife, anyway. So
well, most people.
She's smart, so maybe I no.
Yeah, but most people would give you one of 2 answers. They'd say it's because I took her out too much when she was young.
Yeah, okay.
Or I didn't take her out enough when she's young. But then you have a second child, and because shyness is actually one of the more heritable personality traits in infancy, chances are that the second child won't be as shy, because they're 50% different. So first-degree relatives, siblings, parents, and offspring share 50% of their DNA differences. But that means they don't share 50%. So genetics predicts that kids in a family will be different from one another. And where this comes in with school achievement and intelligence is that you and your wife are well educated and, consider yourself pretty bright. But chances are, on average, if you take parents like you, your children will have a substantially lower IQ and educational achievement. And that's because they're 50% different from you on average. And within a family, it's particularly telling. Environment has a tough time explaining why kids in a family are so different. I don't know if you experience that, but, the Norwegian writer, Karl Ove Knausgård, wrote the 77,500-page autobiography, Mein Kampf, about, his life. And he's particularly good at describing his three kids because he was trained in sociology and taught everything's environmental. And then he had a second child. And he said from the first week of life, these kids were very different. And then they continued, all three of his kids continued to grow up to be very different. Genetics predicts that they'll be different. So that becomes important when you think about how well they're going to advance, say, educationally. That you got to predict kids in a family will be different. And university education is not for everybody.
So what you say, okay, I will get back to what you just said once again. But when you say if you get two smart parents, there are good chances that they're two very smart parents. Is IQ a good thing, you believe? IQ test, a good way to measure intelligence?
It is. And, we can talk about that, but it's been around for 100 years. It's one of the best validated constructs. It correlates with more important things in our society than anything else. So I know people don't like it, but it's just general cognitive ability. It isn't some mystical thing. We could just in a half hour come up with an intelligence test. Mm-hmm. I could just say, well, some people are more intelligent than others. What do you mean? So what should we test there? One of the things you'll come up with is vocabulary. It's actually one of the most predictive single tests for cognitive ability. And then
number of words
Well, yeah. And fluency, you see that in your trade a lot, don't you, And then you might pick up things like memory. And most people would say, well, sort of. But, in England here, we have this thing called University Challenge, which involves knowing little facts, and we know people who have terrific memories that you wouldn't say are particularly bright. They're just very good at memory. But anyway, you got spatial ability, you could say. People would come up with reasoning would be the biggest thing people would come up with, which is central to intelligence. It's like when you're faced with a problem that you haven't solved before, a novel problem. That's where kind of intelligence kicks in. Like that book, Persig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He's saying, when you get down to in the middle of a desert and your motorcycle breaks down and you've got to figure out what's wrong, that's where intelligence clicks in. And most people recognize that. Some people are just quicker at solving problems or deeper at it.
Yeah, sure.
And that's true of the Einsteins too. I mean, they're just dealing with problems. They're dealing with problems that we don't even understand why the problems. But it is problem solving. So anyway, I think it wouldn't be, I bet we could come up with an intelligence test that would probably correlate 0.8 with other intelligence tests. And people have come up with very different intelligence tests, and they all correlate highly with each other. So this myth that, intelligence is what intelligence test measures, I get bored with that because there's 100 years of research on this.
So if you have two, I don't know, if you have, well, that's probably I have the answer within the question I'm about to ask, but if I get two parents that have a 150 IQ, there's a large chance that mine will be not as big.
Yeah, on average even.
On average.
On average, you could say if you took a lot of parents like that, the average IQ of your children will be 125.
Okay.
And that's because it's 50% heritable. If it were 100% heritable, then those kids would have an average IQ of 150.
Okay.
But instead, they'll have an average IQ of 125 with a big range around that, a normal distribution around it, which means some of them will have below average IQs from parents with IQs of 150. And that's the point I'm trying to make. is that if you don't recognize that kids are different genetically, your first child does well at school and the second one doesn't. And you think, what's wrong? Are they lazy or, what's their problem? But they do differ in terms of that sort of aptitude. And to think that we use this golden yardstick of educational achievement to grade everybody is silly because, I don't know that we need so many people at university. We need more like Germany and Switzerland with their apprenticeship systems that teach kids things that they'll get a job at the end of it and that pays for their university tuition while they go. So this is important to me because I read at an early age. My parents didn't go to university. We didn't have a book in our house, literally, except the Bible.
You've read it several times?
No. No. Enough to know it was pretty silly stuff.
My 11 years old daughter now, she had read probably 10 times the whole Harry Potter when she was 9 already. So I believe if she had the Bible, she would have read it 100 times probably.
But what we had were public libraries. So I would take my little wagon and go to the library and get all sorts of books and bring them home.
From what age?
From about 4 or 5.
Did you do a DNA test yourself? Do you know everything about all of these things about you? Okay, we'll get back to that.
Okay. And when I went to school, I loved it. I was just good at it and it was fun and I always did well and got scholarships. My sister, though, was slow to learn to read. She didn't do well at school. She didn't like school. And people just assume that there was something wrong with her. But she hasn't taken a DNA test, but I predict that she would have a much lower genetic score than I do.
But still, see, that's where I'm uncomfortable about this is and maybe that's what you say also, but it's a much lower. It's the term lower at some point. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like we rank in society. You get 140, 150, 130, and then you get 90, and at some point you're a piece of shit, right? So, it sounds like this.
I know,
and that's where I would be so sad to I don't know.
I know what you're saying.
I'm thinking about my three kids. I have Louise, number one. She, how do you say, passed. She went on a higher class. How do you say in English?
She advanced one class.
One class. She reads a lot. She's bright. Very motivated. So I would assume she probably has kind of a, I don't know, maybe it's wrong assuming, but a good DNA, a good luggage at some point. And the other ones, they're good. They're very good, and but it's okay. And I'm trying not to compare, but I would feel uncomfortable if I would have like these proper on the paper saying, she's smarter. She's 140, they're 120, or they're 110, and you're like, what am I going to do with that?
Well,
and maybe the whole society is not ready for that, or we have to change things. I don't know.
I think what I'm trying to suggest is that it's important for parents to recognize that kids in a family are different. And maybe to respect those differences to a greater extent, because I'm actually speaking against the idea of a golden yardstick that everyone's measured against. But in fact, that yardstick exists. It determines where kids go to university. It determines how much money they make. We evaluate people in terms of other quantitative things like money or whatever. But where it comes home is with my sister, it wasn't her fault, I think. It was that she wasn't good at this golden yardstick stuff. She didn't really like to read. She still doesn't like to read much. But she became head of a medical technology lab, a blood lab. It's exactly what she's very good with fine detail of things, extremely responsible. I couldn't bear to have that responsibility. You do a blood test wrong and someone can die.
Yeah.
So, that's a good example, though, of how, maybe she's not so good on the academic side of things, but who cares? I don't think we need more PhDs. We need people who know how to do stuff. So that's the hardest case of all, when you talk about general learning ability. But I think it's important to recognize for parents to understand that their kids will differ. And if Louise does very well at university and the others don't, I think you got to, not just assume it's something you did wrong or something's wrong with them. And increasingly, and this is something we want to get into with entrepreneurship, that increasingly I think it's interest as much as it is ability. We always think of genetics as aptitude here. You're kind of talking about it that way. Well, what can we do about it? It's the aptitude. But I think it's as much appetite as it is aptitude, in the sense that you like to do what you're good at, and you get better at what you like to do. And it's a virtuous circle like that. If you've met these brilliant math kids, like I have a student who had the school for bright kids in Russia, who were very good at math. These kids think math. They joke in math. They hang out with math friends. Math is their life. They just find it so fascinating.
I hang out with a lot of engineers. I know what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And
nerds.
Yeah. But they love it. And so they're good at it. They want to read and find out more and more. And so I do think it is appetite as much as aptitude. So it isn't just a matter of finding out, what you're good at, but you got to find out what you like to do. And that's what I think is important for parents to recognize, is that instead of the basic message here for parents is, instead of trying to make your kid be what you want them to be, what we need to do is to find out what they're good at, what they like to do, and help them do it, which is an important distinction. So we're not doing things for them because we want them to be something we want them to be. We're doing it for them because we love them. We want life to be nice for them. We want them to be happy, even if that is not, succeeding at university, for example. But, if they're happy being a plumber, thank God, we need more good plumbers.
Yeah, if they're happy and it's their destiny. I don't know if it's wow. I mean, I'm thinking, I recorded here with a guy from Sia from Seed Camp, and a VC, venture capitalist. And I mean, at some point we could even think about getting DNA tests for if you want to invest couple of millions into someone, you could try to, see the founding team and see if they match all together on the DNA. Would that be interesting?
So I've had several companies come to me with propositions like that. That if you can, you even find this with race horses. In England, racing horses is a big deal. Or elite athletes, they're particularly into this. Because if you can just predict a little bit better, it can make a big difference at the extreme. If you think of like racehorses, they've been bred forever to run around a circular track. But if you can predict anything that makes it more likely that you'll have you only have to win by a millisecond, right? So it's just tiny differences. And what's interesting with that research, it's less a matter of making them run faster, but it's more a matter of making them healthier. Because one of the main problems is they break their legs. Their legs, everything is so thin and brittle because it makes them faster, but it also makes them weak. So I think it's really fascinating. And I do think this is going to happen. Everybody's going to have their DNA sequence, I think, within a few years, especially as it becomes part of the medical system. And I think, unlike you, a lot of people will say, well, it's my DNA. I want to know. It should be up to me to decide what I know about it.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that I'm searching for, even in French, what I want to say, how I want to say it, but the poetry maybe, or the randomness in life makes sometimes that, I don't know if it's the wrong calculations or just the randomness makes that, I don't want and that's something that you can fight against with the DNA, but a place where you invest only into people going out of Harvard, white, out of male or whatever, or and and maybe at some point, I mean, those tests will end up. Maybe you can make more money investing in that particular field with someone who has a 90 IQ than a 140. I don't know. I'm trying to just to think about maybe we're going to just do the same thing again and again with the bright people. We'll get some elite. I don't know. There is already a kind of elite, but the randomness makes sometimes, I don't know, artistic genius.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Well, genetics is providing the best evidence we have for the importance of randomness. Because randomness is actually fundamental to DNA, beginning with mutations. They're just random. Evolution is random, except for the criterion of reproductive fitness. But at a more psychological level, if genetics accounts for about half of the variance, 50%, the other half is not genetic. But the other big thing that's come out of that research is that the environment works very differently from the way we always assumed we work. It's not nurture. It's not due to systematic effects of family environment. So when I was in graduate school, we were taught in the textbooks that schizophrenia, people would know what that is, right, was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. And it's so wicked because it's wrong. There's no evidence for that. And schizophrenia is one of the more heritable psychiatric disorders. So genetics is important, but genetics doesn't account for all the variance. But 50% of the variance that's not due to genetics is not due to nurture. It's not due to these systematic effects of family environment. And after searching for these influences, like you can think of accidents, illnesses that would happen to one kid and not another, but they don't account for much variance. So a lot of evidence from the life sciences is pointing to randomness as playing a major role. And that means, though, that as a parent, you don't have control of random things.
You're right. I believe we do have control on some kind of randomness. What I'm saying is that...
you make your own luck, that sort of thing?
Yeah, no. Well, you probably don't like this kind of say, but at some point, I do believe in this kind of say, but we can debate on that after. Okay. What I'm saying is that I'm not. There's no favoritism in my kids, but I'm talking about Louise because she's the eldest one. I hope she will accept that when she gets older. But I say just good things. I would say when she was probably 6, even a bit, something like that, 5 or 6. She decided she was bad at math. She didn't like it. That's somehow, and I don't know why, but probably someone has told her that, and I think it's probably something we tell easily to little girls in France, probably around the world. But I mean, math is for boys, right? It's more, I mean, you'll be good in literature, or I don't know, with dolls. I don't know,
But you certainly didn't tell her that.
No, I didn't tell her that, and I just decided you're gonna fucking love maths. No, I didn't say that, but I just said I just refused that she would decide when she was 5 or 6 that she was bad at math because it was too big. It was. I mean, I just said no. She
doesn't know what math is. I mean, they're doing arithmetic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I just focused on just this particular thing for a while with her. Trying to be, to understand and working with, things in life, counting out of the car or everything, getting an app on the iPad to learn math with games and so on. And she started to like math. And I think the randomness at some point was that, I don't know how and why, but she was about to end up not liking math, and maybe she would have just hated it for the rest of her life. Maybe she's going to hate it within 2 years. I don't know, but at least I've tried to just change the way things were going. So
so you can make a difference as an individual parent.
Yeah.
she's probably not going to be a math genius. If she doesn't really like math, maybe she likes it a lot. At 5, that's irrelevant. She didn't know what math was.
That's irrelevant, but that could change the whole way of her life.
Could be. But then math is as heritable as anything else. So the individual differences are very substantially influenced by genetics. Again, not determined. But, it's part of understanding who we are. Are you good at math? Do you like math? That sort of thing. But this whole thing about sex differences, men are from Mars, girls are from Venus, it's nonsense. The variance explained by sex is about 1%.
Okay.
So if you drew the distribution of math ability at age 12 between boys and girls, you'd need a very fine pen to do it because they overlap 99%.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we say girls are good at verbal, boys are good at math. It isn't true. If all you knew about a kid is their sex, you don't know anything about how good they are at math. There's really, at 12, with our standardized test, there's no difference between boys and girls. Yet something happens so that boys go into engineering and girls don't as much. And, who knows what that is?
Which is, for example, I have a company in Tunisia. And in Tunisia, it's 50-50.
Wow.
Yeah. Engineering school, we have engineers in Tunisia, and half of them are women.
And is that a quota system, or is that just the way it falls out?
I think, no, it's the way it falls out.
Great.
It's the way it falls out.
See, and that's what it should be according to the abilities.
I think it's cultural. I mean,
but there's other aspects to it, social aspects, in the sense that women's, despite feminism, we're still kind of locked into traditional roles, and women have children. Women tend to take care of children still, even though there's paternity leave and that sort of thing. So, if that makes it harder for you to do really high pressure sorts of jobs. And we're increasingly trying to take advantage of that. But I'd say at the ability level, there's really no important difference between males and females.
And on other levels, are there some major, I don't know, I was talking about depression or, dementia or Alzheimer, or is there at some other levels big differences?
Well, in childhood, all the major neurological disorders are more common in boys than girls.
All right.
So like autism used to be 10 times more boys than girls, but now, partly because we've expanded the diagnostic category so much, that it's more like 2-to-1, 3-to-1.
Okay.
But it's thought that boys are more neurologically disadvantaged in terms of brain development.
All right.
And partly because girls have 2 X chromosomes.
Yeah.
And that kind of balances the genes off, whereas boys have 1 X and 1 Y. So any bad mutation on the X chromosome shows up in boys because they don't have the counterbalancing chromosome. We probably don't want to go there. But anyway, boys have more neurological problems than girls. But depression is more common in women. Not 2-to-1 or anything like that, but, another probably 50% more. And schizophrenia is the same for males and females. Dementia affects, well, I'm not sure about dementia. But the main thing is that the sex differences really aren't that important. We tend to think in black and white categories, males, females, but really it's individual differences that's important.
And speaking about black and white, I'm going to a place where, I don't know, maybe it's Asians, Africans, does the background, geographical background changes things on DNA, obviously, at some point on the color of the skin, but on dementia, IQ, I don't know.
Well, most of the DNA work has been done in Northern European populations, America and Australia, not because people are discriminating. It's just that's where the research was done and was funded. But the biggest move now in DNA research is to look more universally at other countries, other ancestries. Because what we know so far is when we get these predictors in Northern European populations, the DNA predictors, they don't predict nearly as well in, say, Southeast Asian populations or in African populations. And Africa is particularly interesting because genetically, they're much more, we say, heterogeneous. They're more different. We can't talk about African genes because there's actually micro groupings there that they're as different from one another as some European countries are from each other, So it's fascinating. And there's big projects now funded in the US, in the EU, and in Asia to try to get a better representation of human DNA rather than just those populations that thousands of years ago migrated to Northern Europe.
Does the expression walk on eggs works in English?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Walk on eggs. It sounded like you said woke.
Walk on eggs.
Yeah.
Because I believe that's also where in your specialties, in your profession, things can be very interpreted very, badly. So I believe it's. Am I wrong? In the US, you shouldn't. Put your DNA and know the color of the skin next to it. You know what I'm saying? Or
are you saying you can predict color of skin with DNA?
Can we?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So if I have your DNA, I know your color, the color of your skin, or
we can predict very close your height. It's 90% heritable. Okay. Your eye color. So in forensics, DNA has revolutionized it now because with one cell you can get DNA and do these polygenic scores so that you can do a mugshot not from people's memories, but from DNA. You can talk about ethnicity, height, hair color, eye color with great accuracy.
So if I go for a DNA test for my kid when they're 1 day old, I will know quite a lot of things.
You will, yes. And I know that it's difficult at some level, but for me...
How many kids do you have?
Depends how you count. I was married different times. I've inherited some kids. So I've one biological child to speak of. Being French, you'll know what that means. And I have several kids I've adopted with as I've gotten married several times.
Okay, so maybe you have
we have
French background.
Five kids altogether.
Okay,
yeah.
Maybe you have a French. I've read you had some European background, but maybe you do. Would you recommend to your kids, or would you have, if you would have kids today?
Yeah.
Get a DNA test on day one?
Well, interesting question. In the States now, and especially in Southeast Asia for some reason, it's the go-to shower party. Do you know a shower?
Yeah,
Women's pregnant and she has this party with her girlfriends and
yeah, he's going to have a 150 IQ.
Yeah.
And blue eyes. My God.
So people are doing it, and especially in Southeast Asia, and especially in China. Maybe
before
with the one
born,
child,
right?
That's right. With the one-child policy. So there's another aspect to this. One of the hottest areas now is DNA dating.
Yeah. Okay.
If you think of all these dating websites, people put up all sorts of phony information about themselves, don't they? But there's a famous researcher, George Church at MIT, who offers to do DNA sequencing for any couple that's planning to get together. And the reason for that is not for the silly things, but there's several thousand single gene disorders, and they're mostly very rare. But all of us have 4, 5, 6, 7 of these, but they're recessive. Do you know from Mendel we learned that some genes, like Huntington's, are dominant. If you get one copy of it, you'll have the disease. But that quickly gets weeded out in the population because it's fatal. But the thing about Alzheimer's, it slips by natural selection because you don't know about it until after your childbearing age. The average age of onset is like 55. So you don't know about it, therefore it doesn't affect reproduction. But with the vast majority of these recessive disorders, you need 2 copies. You need a copy from your mother, a copy from your father. So if there are thousands of these and we only have 4 or 5, what are the chances you're going to mate with someone who has one of those, 4 or 5? And the answer is something like 5%. So that means you have a 5% risk that when you mate with someone, they're going to have one of these matching deleterious recessive alleles. And the reason George Church does this, provides this service, is that wouldn't you want to know if the person you're about to have kids with has this matching recessive mutation? Because that means 1 out of 4 of your children will have the disease, and half of them will be carriers for the disease.
I get that completely. May I ask a personal question? Mm-hmm. How many wives do you have? Did you have?
It depends how you count, but I've been formally married 3 times.
Formally married 3 times. Did you have a good life? Are you happy about?
Yeah, I would say so. I got married very young. That's partly my excuse. And this is one of my wives on the phone right now.
All right.
And,
do you have to,
I thought I turned off my phone.
Yeah, you can. It's okay. It's okay. The question I'm asking myself while Robert is checking his phone is, you can tell her we're talking about her. So is it the most recent wife?
Yes.
Yeah. And, the idea is that, randomness of life. I mean, obviously, if we talk about those diseases, I mean, you're happy to know that maybe you don't want those chances, but you will definitely go further at some point. You will want to know, if this and this matches. I mean, if your kids are going to be fat, if your kids are going to be stupid, if your kids are going to be whatever, and if there are chances that we have a good life together, that we're happy. I don't know. Maybe can we predict that? I don't know. And see, I mean, the whole romance and the whole poetry about that is, see my point? I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. There's always going to be a lot of chance because these things are only 50% heritable to begin with. So you get your randomness, even if you buy my message of genetics.
Yeah.
But part of knowing yourself, I think, is understanding your genetic propensities. So for example,
if I get something, for example, if you say this girl is will probably be depressed, I'll say, well, next, this girl is probably going to be, I don't know. All of these things. You choose at some point, like on Tinder, you get the IQ, the depression chances in life, and so on, and it's wow.
Well, but you do that already. You do it much more accurately than a DNA test could do it. When you get to know somebody, you find out, maybe not on the first date, but you soon find out if they're depressive, and you can decide that's cool. Younger when I was younger, I found women who were crazy attractive because I'm not crazy, and you do find that stimulating and exciting. But then you learn, and I think this is true of many men. You learn that isn't a good prognosis for a long-term relationship. It gets.
I know what you're talking about.
It gets wearing. It tires you out pretty quickly, and so. You can predict depression much better by knowing somebody than you can from DNA. You can certainly predict their intelligence much better by knowing them. And you can show that there's something called assortative mating, like attracts like. So that's more so for intelligence than any other trait. And you sort of know that. You know someone's vocabulary and how they think.
Sure.
And so one night stand, you can go out with someone and you don't have to talk to them in the morning. It's fine.
But, my vocabulary is it's also my mom. She calls me after every single podcast and say, stop saying this like that. Stop. I love this episode, but you're talking like this and change this word. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm 44, mom. But, yeah.
Well, and the thing is, you can change it. It's just your propensities here. And so my point, though, is with the picking a spouse, you don't like the idea of the DNA because it takes away some of the romance. But actually, you're predicting all these same things: mental health, cognitive abilities, personality? I mean, do you want someone who's very outgoing, lively, or do you like someone who's more serious, intellectual? So you make these decisions anyway. So the DNA isn't going to add much to that.
And all of these things you've said right now, outgoing or introverted, shy, is written in your DNA. You can find
Nothing's written in your DNA, right? It's only an influence.
Okay.
Everything is heritable. You can't find any trait in psychology that's reliably measured that does not show significant genetic influence. So that means for everything, we can find out DNA that predicts it eventually. We need to do these very large studies. So right now, those large genome-wide studies, we call them DNA studies, are only done on the most important traits like schizophrenia, bipolar, depression.
I have so many mixed feelings about this because
I know. But by the end of this conversation, you're going to get over it.
But it's not, it's not because I'm into it. I mean, you're even more into it than I am because you've been into it for 50 years. But it's so deep, so scary. I mean, does it scare you sometimes? I mean, what I'm saying is that at some point we will choose which egg we will use to get kids because you get DNA cells in an egg, or no?
Yeah, but again, you can deal with, take in vitro fertilization is where that has to happen, right? It happens now, right? People they spend their whole life having abortions and trying not to get pregnant, then they want to get pregnant, and then they can't.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, older educated couples are having in vitro fertilization. Sure. And when you do that, you create, say, a dozen embryos, not just one. So you you get a dozen eggs and you match it with sperm and you get a dozen embryos. And what you do is you see which ones are healthy looking, right?
Not with a DNA test. It's just the eyes or...
But then about a quarter of the people who do the in vitro fertilization are doing it because they know they have a recessive mutation. And 1/4 of their offspring will have the disease. And many of these are horrible diseases, like Tay-Sachs disease in Ashkenazi Jew populations. They have this gene at a much higher frequency than other people. They started doing this DNA testing 20 years ago. And they've now, they already have, they mate, what do you call it? Where they...
Do you want me to help you with your English?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The kids don't marry whoever they like. They're arranged marriages,
sure. Okay.
And now that's a standard part of the procedure where they see if they're both carriers for the recessive gene for Tay-Sachs disease. Because it's a horrible disease. The kid dies in the first few years of life, having no quality of life before then either, So no one would object to doing that because... suppose you and the person you want to marry both have that recessive allele. You could still decide to do it because you could have in vitro fertilization that would then say, of the 12 embryos, here are 3 that have a double recessive for the Tay-Sachs, say. So you don't put those in. You put one of the others in. Now, other people, though, who do in vitro fertilization just to have a kid, they're not screening for a mutation. You could say you can't put them all in. You can only, in the UK, you can only put 1 in because in vitro fertilization is actually so successful that if you put 2 in, you have a 70% chance of having twins, which is a medical risk. We're not meant to have multiple births, So you have to make the decision which embryo you're going to put in. So not to decide to screen for DNA is a decision. And you could say, well, with 1 cell from the embryo, I can tell you this one has a severe risk of cardiovascular disease. And, but then your point is, but then you could say this one is going to be tall. This one's going to be fat. This one's going to be highly intelligent. And that's the scare for you. But I think, you can only put 1 in anyway.
The scare is to just kind of get a catalog, right? It's just to say, yeah, I mean, which kind of kid you want? I mean, number 1, fat, number 2, smart, number 3, yeah, it's going to be fun. Yeah, I mean, it's, let's get fat kids, I mean.
Well, people already do that when they select embryos. There are these books that's like cattle or something, where you do get these profiles of women's eggs or men's sperm that they're donating.
Yeah.
And if you ask the adoptive parents they need to adopt a child, so they need to have someone else's egg most often, or sometimes someone else's sperm, what are they interested in? Intelligence is far and away the most important. The next thing is they don't want someone who's a heavy drug user, for example. Yeah. But so this sort of stuff is happening without DNA, but I think DNA does bring it to another level. And this film Gattaca?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So that's exactly what it's about. And it's a prescient film. It predicts all these problems you're raising.
Incredible, yeah.
Like designer babies and, people's lives being dictated from their DNA at birth. But it's prescient about what's going to happen because it's all happening now. That film was, 1996 or something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Before the human genome was sequenced, which was 2003. So it was an incredibly prescient film.
Incredible.
But the finale of the film, what happened as a result of that, I think is not necessary at all. It was a totalitarian government that dictated, what you can do given a certain DNA.
Have you seen Gattaca, Clémence? No? Okay.
And the hero, Ethan Hawke, wanted to be an astronaut, and he had a severe risk of heart attack. And so the subtitle of the film is, There is no gene for the human spirit. And he shows that he can become an astronaut even though, he has this risk of a heart attack. And he buys Jude Law's DNA, who is an athlete. But it doesn't have to be that way. Of the utopias, you got 1984, which was total totalitarian government that dictated everything environmentally, right? There was no DNA involved in 1984. But then you've got Brave New World, which offered people soma, a drug that just makes them happy, and it did use DNA, and not in a prescient way. It had it all wrong about what you would do if you had DNA and you were predicting. It was more concerned about getting a worker class and that sort of thing. It was kind of silly on that score. But what's happened, in a way, the reason Gattaca was so clever is it implied that it wasn't completely a totalitarian government dictating everything, which is superficially what it looks like. It's actually consumer-driven. In the sense that people said, well, I better do the in vitro fertilization and pick the brightest baby. 'Cause that was called natural birth then, do you remember? And his brother was born in the back, was conceived in the back seat of a car. That was called faith birth or something like that, But I think the idea of it being consumer-led is interesting because that's what's happening. It's not going to be the government dictating. It's going to be people deciding these issues for themselves. So maybe we need to regulate it or whatever. And that comes down to these old issues, of individual rights and the rights of children. Should you have the right to have a child who is going to be institutionalized?
Yeah, because when I laughed about, let's get fat people, the idea was just to say, people could just maybe experiment, things. Just say, everybody wants those kind of kids. Let's have fun. We're going to do something else, right? And document it, maybe make movies out of it. It could be, weird, completely. No, wouldn't be. I don't know. It would be crazy. You must have some enemies within churches, or I don't know. I think about France, but even in the US, it's kind of God's will manipulation, something like this. But all of these things, I'm not Christian, or I'm not.
You'd think so.
I don't know. It's you're not astonished about what I'm saying, are you?
No. You know that people do have these reactions. When my book came out a few years ago, it came out. It's called Blueprint.
Okay, but in French, so it's called. I had it here. It's l'architecte invisible. You like that title?
I like that title better.
The invisible architect.
Because Blueprint is not good. Blueprint are these architectural plans for a building. I understand there's no real word for blueprint in French.
Les plans,
le plan.
Yeah.
But that's not the way DNA works. That's too deterministic in a way. But my editor at Penguin decided that was a good title. And she's probably right. It gets people's attention. But in a way, it gets their, do you have the phrase backs up, raises their hackles. But so when my book came out, I was very concerned about the reaction to it. Because I have always just done the science. I decided I wasn't going to, get into the public sphere. I was going to do my science and hope that eventually, as enough data piles up, people will understand the importance of genetics. And then the DNA revolution came along. It's pretty hard to argue with DNA when I say, look, I happen to know anything about you, and I can predict your height, weight, cardiovascular risk.
It's factual.
It's factual. But still, I think being in academia, there's probably more of a reaction. Like in education, which is some of the areas I work in, it's still the backwater of anti-genetic sort of feeling. And to some extent, it's motivated by political ideology. So I was prepared for a strong reaction, but I was at an age and a point in my career where I could say, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to tell it like I think it is. I'm not going to pull my punches. I'm not going to be shoving it in people's faces. I'm going to say, I understand people can be concerned about some of these things, but look at all the positive aspects of this.
Is it easy to read?
It was meant to be.
Okay.
People do tell me it's a bit more difficult than most popular books, but it's selling very well. It's been translated into 20 countries.
How many copies?
It's hard to find that out, but
all right.
But I'm making money on it. I had this wonderful agent in New York. He's famous, Brockman, and his motto is, "You get such a big advance, you'll never get a royalty." Do you see how that works?
You mean how it works,
and I did get a huge advance, but I am getting royalties.
Yeah,
so
right.
I know it must be selling reasonably well.
Yeah, okay, you got him wrong. So we say here it's factual, and I buy it totally. But I get to this article in a French magazine called L'Express, and this geneticien, French geneticien called Françoise Clerget d'Arpoux, she reacts on your book when it came out in France recently. And she said Robert Plomin is wrong when he says the education doesn't count much into a scholar success, right? Where do you disagree? Where does she disagree, and where do you disagree?
Yeah.
Can you tell
I
me?
think she's just wrong. It's not her area.
Okay.
She's a single gene sort of molecular geneticist, and when people get outside their expertise, you don't have to pay much attention to them. Plus, that was one sort of negative review, but all the rest of the reviews I know of are very positive.
Yeah. So do I.
So this is one person. I don't really think I have to speak to her. I don't think she read my book. She did. She'd understand. I'm saying it's not deterministic. But here's the mountain of evidence that individual differences in how well kids do at school is due substantially, about half, to genetic differences. And that comes from twin studies, adoption studies, and now DNA studies. And I don't see how a reasonable person can deny that. It's not to say it's deterministic, though, which is why I started the conversation that way,
sure.
But part of understanding ourselves and understanding our children is realizing that kids are not a blob of clay to be molded the way you want to mold it. It has propensities, and there's a lot of implications that come from that, some of which we've talked about already. So, I just don't value her response much. It's not just that it's negative. I can take negative stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But what I've been interested in is when I give these public lectures, there really is no hostility. People are accepting. It's mostly they say they haven't heard about this stuff before, and that they find it illuminating and, to some extent, exciting and useful information. Like my highest, we call them polygenic scores. These are DNA scores based on thousands of DNA differences. So you can predict obesity pretty well too, not nearly as well as height. But people are surprised to find that individual differences in weight, body mass index, are about 60% due to DNA differences that you inherit. Despite the fact that some of us are on diets, some of us exercise a lot more, some of us watch our weight a lot more. Still, the differences that exist are mostly due to DNA differences. And we can now use DNA to predict about 20% of the variance of weight. Well, I did the first polygenic score profile for any human being for myself in my book. And my highest risk score, it's not for schizophrenia or psychiatric disorders or Alzheimer's. I have a relatively low polygenic risk for that. It's for body mass index and obesity. I'm at the 94th percentile genetically. And it's a great example, though, because some people would say, well, you don't want to tell people about that. They're just going to give up and say, I'm a genetic fatty. I can't do anything about it. I might as well just eat, drink, and be merry and not worry about it. It doesn't work that way. I've known I put on weight more easily than other people, and I find it harder to lose it. Skinny people like you don't understand that you would think just, get some willpower, and just control it. And that's true to a certain level. If you lock me in a closet, I don't eat food, I lose weight. Yeah. But life isn't like that. Right out here outside on Carnaby Street, you're bombarded with food and cues. And so for those of us who are just more susceptible to those sorts of cues, it just is harder to keep the pounds off. And partly it's because we have these Stone Age brains, because the genes for obesity involve mostly putting on fat, storing fat.
My God, I so want to go to get those DNA tests, because I would. You say you say those skinny people like you as you talk about me, but I would be pretty sure, and it's kind of this what you said earlier on about the people you date, right? If they're smart, if they can get depression or and actually I do believe that I'm probably like you, but I found it out myself, right? So I found out that if I eat like not well, I have to get a lot of discipline on this. I have to get a lot of sports, a lot of things. I'm not natural born skinny.
Right.
So it's something that is but so there are some things like what you're saying that you basically know, right? But it confirms things.
It does, and it helps me. It motivates me to lose weight, to realize it's a biological thing.
Yeah, I get that.
And so what I do is I engineer my environment. I just don't have junk food in the house.
Yeah, sure.
Because,
this office.
I noticed when you walk in.
My God, it's a nightmare. I would be like, look at Clémence. She would eat like all day long. Same for me. Okay. What is the range of things you get? One question is, let's put brands on the table. I don't care. For example, if you get 23andMe or here in the UK or some other maybe European countries, is there any DNA test you would recommend more than another?
Well, they all do a good job at genome.
You don't have any capital interest?
No, I don't have any interest in these companies. I've stayed away from that. But 23andMe is the single biggest company, and they don't provide much of the information I'm talking about because they got burned by the FDA a few years ago because they initially marketed their tests as entertainment. Find out about yourself.
Yeah, where you come from.
Yeah.
Is your father your father? Yeah.
Well, that's another whole story now. There are actually companies that focus on paternity testing, which I think is a special issue in France, probably. But they had to shut down for 2 years because basically the FDA said, you're providing information on breast cancer, Alzheimer's, that is medical level quality. It isn't just entertainment. This is real life stuff. And so they then had to go through certification at medical sorts of levels, which is a much higher standard. In general, this DNA world is unregulated. I mean, it's quite amazing,
which is scary.
It is scary. So now 23andMe, though, having been burned by the FDA and shut down for a couple of years, they're now just focusing on things you can predict with total accuracy, these single gene disorders.
Okay.
And they do provide a polygenic score for BMI, but there's about 300 or so polygenic scores you can create, and they don't want to go there.
Okay.
Because it's probabilistic. It's hard enough to get people to understand risk when you say it's a single gene, and if you and your wife are carriers, you'll have a 25% risk. That's hard enough. But imagine these polygenic scores, which are completely probabilistic and statistical. It's very hard to get people to understand it. But what they do is they allow you to push a button, if you can find it. They don't make it that easy to find, where you can download your 1 million or so basic DNA. These are the steps in the spiral staircase that they genotype, where we differ. And then there are other companies that will create polygenic scores for you.
Out of this data?
Yeah. So you
like
download your
GPT-4.
genotypes from 23andMe, and you upload them to one of these other companies, and they provide the polygenic score information, but they don't do it well. Okay. So they don't do it at a standard.
Do you have any names of those?
It's not at all regulated. Oh. There's one that was very good because it was university run, not for profit.
Okay.
And they weren't collecting your DNA to sell it on commercially, which is what these free companies, you get what you pay for. And if it's free, you got to say, well, why are they doing
the products.
this? Yeah. But this company now, I think, has sold out.
Okay.
So I don't think there is any place you can go now. It'll happen. But there's no place I would recommend now. I mean, the university labs, we do this routinely with the people we study. Because once you do this DNA test, you can create any of these hundreds of polygenic scores. It uses the same DNA information. So it's a shame that the companies that say they do it very badly. They would never get their data published in a scientific journal because it's done so badly. And they're very secretive about it, but I can tell what they're doing, and what they're doing is not good. So it's a shame that right now you can't buy that. But 23andMe, you do get a lot of information about single genes. A lot of it's quirky stuff. But what surprises me is that most people do the DNA testing, not for the sort of thing we've been talking about, but for ancestry.
Yeah, sure. Where do they come from? Are they Ashkenazi, African, or Asian, or Mediterranean? Yeah.
And it's quite surprising, for a lot of people.
It's entertainment.
It is. That probably is entertainment, yeah. But it's part of understanding yourself, isn't it? Kind of knowing where you come from. People have always been interested in genealogy, but now with DNA, you can do that so much better. You don't need family records. The DNA now can get you down to a village in Romania, Yeah.
Do you get into a thoughts book into where it should go and should not go? I'm saying, we were talking about, VC firms that would invest in these kind of DNA type people, or dating or recruiting. I mean, I could say, okay, before I sign your contract, I'd like to have your DNA profile. I mean, it could be, wow.
Which was a big part of Gattaca, do you remember?
Yeah.
He couldn't get a job. He could only be a janitor because his DNA said he wasn't, he was at risk, for heart attacks. So companies have approached me to do this sort of thing. And I think it will happen eventually. We already know that when interviews are pretty much worthless. They just don't predict job success.
Yeah, that's why I recruit everyone on the spot, so I get... No, I'm kidding.
No, but if you could add any accuracy to your selection process, you got to say, at a cognitive level, why not? You give people tests, don't they? They give them personality tests. Well, that isn't very predictive either.
I had IQ and EQ test for recruitment. Actually, before coming here to London, back in it was 2004.
I think in the States that would be illegal, wouldn't it, to give an intelligence test?
It was a Swedish company.
Yeah.
They had me. Both IQ and EQ.
Yeah. So we can regulate these things, I suppose. You could say, no, that's not acceptable. It's sort of regulated, genetics is regulated in insurance because that was the main concern.
Definitely.
Yeah. Where
you cannot drive or you cannot buy a house because your DNA is not so strong, right?
Which is what Gattaca was about.
Yeah.
But with the insurance things, it's complicated because if you're trying to make money as an insurance company, and I know you have this high risk of having a severe heart attack, and I don't, who would you insure? Or if they insured you, they would want to charge a lot more money. And now the counter argument is, you can get your DNA done and know you're at that risk. And because it's done in this unregulated sphere, the insurance company wouldn't know.
Or
so you could
if it's unregulated, they might be able to know because they could buy data on from another source. Or
possibly, yeah. But the point I'm making is that it's a very tricky issue when it comes to insurance, and it's one of the reasons why I think national health services are going to be more valuable, because I don't know how insurance-based healthcare systems are going to work in the genomic era. Because the nice thing about a national health is that it spreads the risk.
Because at some point, yeah, exactly. But what we want is to spread the risk on a national level and have probably, what I want is probably have everybody to be able to, buy a house or drive or whatever. Driving is even a question. Do we want everybody to be able to drive, even though we know they have these 10 times more chances to have an accident? I don't know. But it's true. That's what we would want. But if you're on the good part of the team, right, and you're in the 10% of the people who will not have heart attacks and have the good DNA, you would be very happy to have cheaper insurance at the end, right? So on an individual level, it's...
But things probably do balance out, don't you think? Maybe you don't have a heart attack risk, but maybe you have a risk for depression. Depression probably is as costly in society as heart attacks. Do you know?
So in your journey, have you ever, had some, could I say, perfect DNA? Like some people you would met, who you would read some DNA test and be like, wow, this guy or this girl is just like smart, no depression, everything is like a AAA?
Well, no, because I don't know people's personal DNA information, but you know that already, like we were talking about when you meet a spouse, it's probably a better predictor. You say very smart. Well, we know that. And you could say attractive, tall.
Margot Robbie, right?
That.
I would...
not my type, actually.
Yeah, but at the end, she's beautiful, smart, creative. Funny. Margot Robbie, my God. I would... I would ask some question about the previous studies you had, because you've done... You're famous, worldwide famous for your studies on the twins. And that was prior to... the whole DNA thing,
Absolutely.
Right? So it was more, even though we've seen DNA is a lot of statistics, afterwards, it was also a statistical work, right? So the idea was to, can you tell me a bit about this?
We should explain the twin method, because I don't think it's totally obvious to people.
I'd love you to explain that. And before you do so, I'd like you to react maybe after or whenever you want, but to a talk I had last week with the mother of twins, and she was like, they are so different, and they're from the day they are born, they are so different. And I was like, okay, I want Robert to tell me what he thinks about it.
Were they identical twins? Or?
Yeah, they were identical twins. Yeah.
She's sure of that?
Yeah, she's sure of that.
Because then they'll be very similar looking.
Of course, obviously.
Okay. Yeah, well, I can deal with that.
Identical twin is that they were in the same egg, right?
Yeah, well, it's there are two types of twins. 1% of all births are twins, almost around the world, and a third of those are identical twins. They're called monozygotic.
Because they were monozygotic.
They're a single fertilized egg, which is a zygote.
100%. Yeah,
right.
And they were made from
and that means
what do you call in vitro? So I believe in vitro is not, but they are monozygotic.
No,
I'm sure.
Not if it's in vitro.
Okay, but these are, I mean, they're totally similar, but they are monozygotic.
How old are they?
2 years old.
It's still a little early. I mean, all twins look very similar, at birth pretty much.
Yeah.
And then the identical twins get more and more similar, and the other type of twin, fraternal twins, get less and more. But I'm getting ahead of the story here.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
monozygotic twins have the same DNA. So a single zygote splits in the first 10 days of life. And these two zygotes are clones of one another. When you sequence their DNA, they have the same DNA. Now, some people say they don't, but we can go into that, but they are identical genetically. The other type of twin is like any brother and sister who happen to be born at the same time. So they're separately fertilized eggs. They have different sperm and different egg, which is why they're called dizygotic, two zygotes. So they're like any brother and sister who grew up in the same womb at the same time. And half of them are opposite sex twins, by probability, and half are same-sex twins, right? Identical twins are always same sex.
Yeah, sure.
Right, okay. So this is like a natural experiment, though, in a way, because you've got one group of twins who, within each pair, they're genetically identical twins, and then the fraternal twins are those that are only 50% similar genetically. So if a trait shows genetic influence, you'd have to predict that the identical twins will be more similar for the trait than the fraternal twins.
Yep.
And the surprise was, everywhere you looked, from personality to cognitive abilities to physical traits, you find that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins.
Yeah.
And you can use the extent to which those correlations differ to estimate what we call heritability, the extent to which genetic influence is important. So not only is there significant genetic influence, how much variance does it account for? And that's where we get to this 50% on average for psychological traits. So that the most heritable traits like cognitive abilities are 60% heritable, the least heritable traits are 40% heritable, like personality. Most traits are in the middle. So it's 40 to 60%, which isn't a big deal, really, because that's just a hell of a lot of variance being explained by genetics.
That means when you say 40% for personality, that means there are, tell me if I'm wrong, 40% chances that those identical twins have the same personality. I don't know what it means, but
no, it's not the same. It's that we're talking about differences between people in a population.
Yeah.
And so what it's saying is, of the differences in, say, self-report personality questionnaires, like extroversion.
Okay. Yeah.
Those differences are 40% due to inherited DNA.
Okay.
And it's the differences that's important. So it doesn't mean one person's personality is 40% due to their DNA and the other 60% to the environment. But what it does mean is 40% of the differences in the populations that we study is due to inherited DNA differences. That means 60% is not. And that's where your identical twins can be quite different.
Are there any areas or conclusions you had with your twin studies that have been proven wrong by DNA and by the next level of things?
Only when I bet against DNA. So I thought back in the early days when I was in graduate school, I wanted to find traits that did not show genetic influence. So I asked a lot of psychologists, what do you think would not show genetic influence? Like, what would you think of in your kids? What is something that, you did for them and couldn't have anything to do with their DNA? And the one thing they'd come up with is like kindness, which I kind of believed, How about table manners?
Yeah.
That should be something solely taught by the parents.
Yeah.
So I included measures of these things that psychologists thought would not show genetic influence. And they showed almost as much genetic influence
You have
as
to see what's
personality traits.
what is it? George, the little royal family baby, who's like completely going crazy in all of those.
Yes.
Like all of his manners are completely crazy. I mean, so you could say somehow, I don't know what he's inherited, but he seems to be hard to.
You can look at those three siblings and see pretty substantial differences, even very early on in life. So the point is that even these things you don't think are heritable, like table manners, well, partly that's what your parents teach you, but partly it's if you're a really hyperactive kid, you're not going to be what we think of. I don't know if this is pejorative, but we think of French kids as kind of the prototypic well-mannered kids because they'll sit in a restaurant for hours with their parents, and not be wild. I don't know where they managed to get that, but that isn't true of most other kids, like American kids, for example.
It works if they have iPads in front of their
maybe.
Maybe. No, in America, I would love my kids to be like that, but I believe,
So when I bet that in our first study, kindness seemed to be less heritable than other traits. So I thought, right, okay, I'm right. But then half a dozen studies came out saying, no, kindness is just as heritable as other traits. And in part, you can sort of see that. What is kindness? It's like, being concerned if someone's feeling pain or whatever. But, one of the more heritable disorders in childhood is psychopathy, which, does that translate in French, psychopathy?
Psychopath.
Yeah, psychopath. They don't want to hurt people. It's just they don't care about hurting people. If a child wants something, they'll grab it, even if, they take it away from you or push you out of the way to get it, So that's part of what we mean by kindness. A kind person wouldn't do that. They'd be concerned if you feel pain. Psychopaths don't, though. They don't respond to your pain, even at a physiological level.
It's not their fault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's like, so I looked for this word, wickedness, malice or méchanceté. Malice. That's potentially, or not even potentially, that's inheritable. So if you get kindness, wickedness is inheritable.
It's just that empirically, everything you study, including things I thought would not show any genetic influence, like kindness, does. Another one is religiosity. That shows genetic influence. It's just, do you believe in an old man with a white beard up there in the sky somewhere? Are you religious? That shows genetic influence. The only thing that doesn't is religion, which religious faith you are, because that's so much determined by your parents. But then later in life, a lot of people leave, like me. I was raised a Catholic and at the age of 12 decided that was nonsense.
Yeah. So did I.
So it is a surprise that everything's heritable, but when you think about it, it's not so surprising. The biggest area that surprised people was that environmental measures show genetic influence. And that's called the nature of nurture. And
this is going too far.
No, but you know,
get it? Okay, go.
Yeah, but in psychology, the measures that are most used as environmental measures are like parenting.
Yeah.
Are you loving to your kids? How disciplinarian are you to your kids? Life events, stuff happens to you, that's used in thousands of studies as an environmental measure. Social support, how many friends do you have? Well, those are always assumed for a century to be environmental measures. But actually, it's not like the environment out there that happens to us passively. Like in life events, the most predictive items there are getting in conflict with other people, having financial problems. That isn't just what happens to you. It's partly who you are. And that's where the genetics comes in. And as proof of that, there are some items on life events that you hope would show no genetic influence. And that's like death of a spouse or family member. You hope you don't have much to do with that. And in fact, that shows no genetic influence. But the vast majority of these items are not the environment out there happening to us. It's how we experience the environment. And so it's actually kind of a profound point. That's the way genes work. They're not hardwired. vocabulary is the most highly heritable cognitive test. But we're not born with vocabulary words. We learn them. But some people learn them more easily and they're interested in it. I have one of 6 grandchildren who is totally interested in words. She always wants to know, well, why did you use that word? What's the difference between that word and this word? And the other 5, whatever, you know what I mean. They don't care, And so, who's going to develop the better vocabulary? But it's not because it was hardwired. It's because of this appetite as well as aptitude. She's just totally into
the question you always have is, what if she were born in a family where there were no vocabulary?
Exactly. And the other method, other than the twin method, which we've talked about briefly here, is the adoption method. And the simplest adoption study that people understand is identical twins reared apart in uncorrelated environments.
Yeah.
So there's several hundred pairs of these. And
there was that movie, right?
Exactly. 3 Identical Strangers. I strongly recommend that to people. It won the film award at Sundance about 3 years ago. It's available on all streaming services.
3 Identical Strangers.
And the reason it's 3 is that the film starts with this guy who grew up in a very wealthy family in Long Island, one of the richest areas of New York. And then when he went to university on the first day in upstate New York, his name was Bobby, and everyone was calling him Eddie. And he thought it's a psychology experiment. He thought he was looking around for the hidden cameras. But then he met Eddie, and they quickly realized it was like looking in the mirror.
Okay.
These guys were so similar with their tight curly hair, height. Both wrestlers, they had that sort of build, and they worked out that they had the same birthday. They were adopted from the same adoption agency in Brooklyn. And the publicity that came from that led to a 3rd identical twin. And that's because when these eggs separate, the zygotes separate into 2 identical zygotes. Sometimes one of those splits again, and you get 3 identical twins, identical triplets in this sense. And what was interesting in the film is that one kid was born in one of the wealthiest families. One kid was born in
middle class,
a middle class where the father's a high school teacher, and the other was in lower class immigrant parents who just ran a little corner shop. And yet, from the film, it's just so obvious these guys are totally similar in personality and in cognitive ability, academics as well. They're the type of student I really like. They don't like academics, but they like to read, they like to argue, they're intellectual. And when they got together, they all decided they'd drop out of university and move to Manhattan, start a nightclub called Triplets, and it made $1 million in the first year. And they lived this wild life in this bachelor pad in Manhattan. Their genetics kind of nudge them towards a niche that fit their genetic propensities. They decided they don't like academics, so why are they doing this?
But that's not a real story, is it?
It's totally true.
Totally true. Okay.
Yeah, it's totally true.
There has been in this area a doctor or someone who has made some strange.
So they say, this is the 1950s. It's here in London, Cyril Burt. It's a long story. Most people feel that the charges of him faking data are not true.
Okay.
He lost his data during bombing in the Second World War. As Sir Cyril Burt, he was mostly concerned, as I am, about using genetics to help promote kids who otherwise wouldn't have the chances to do that.
Yeah.
So, what I'd like to do is, we were talking about bright parents having less bright children.
Yeah.
That the opposite side of that is most of the brightest kids in the next generation are not going to come from the brightest parents because there's relatively few of them. The vast majority of the brightest kids are going to come from the middle of the distribution because there's 80% of the parents there and there's only like 5 or 10% at the other end.
If you take it nationwide, that could make a huge difference.
Exactly.
For the future of a nation,
absolutely
but
right.
that would probably come up in a totalitarian country first, wouldn't it?
Maybe, but what I've been pushing for, I haven't been successful getting money for this, and I do think I might get some not venture capital money, but other money to do this. At the lowest end of the distribution, say if you take the most socially disadvantaged kids in France or in England, they actually will have a big range of polygenic scores for learning ability. Because their parents aren't necessarily the lowest, but even if they are, you could take the parents, just as we said, the parents at the highest end are going to have kids with a wide range, including some below average. The people at the lowest end will have some kids who are actually well above average, but also the people who are socially disadvantaged have a wide range of polygenic scores themselves. It's not as if they're all low SES
it's true.
because of the
that
genetics.
You're right.
It's social disadvantage. So I think there's a tremendous wasted intellectual capital for these kids from the most socially deprived environments who, even if they have the genetic goods, the system just puts them down.
Yeah.
They're just not going to make it. And so I would like to be able to do something for those kids and to help them succeed.
I love the idea. Obviously, I think it's great. The whole thing where you project this is at the end, would we all be aware of in which castes we are? Is there like the elite of these good kids? And those guys from different origins that goes in this.
But again, it's happening already, right?
Yeah.
Here we have streaming.
It would be.
I don't know if you do in France, but kids who are good at math are put in special streams and they go to special classes.
Yeah, sure.
And they give them names like bluebirds and robins. But the kids know. The kids know which ones are having trouble learning to read or that sort of thing. So we already do know that. And the kids aren't going to read each other's DNA profiles because you can see it phenotypically. That is, we can observe it ourselves, a lot of these things. And so you don't need the DNA to do that. And I just wish that we could have more of the Finnish model, the idea that what education is about is spending whatever it takes to get everybody up to minimal levels of literacy and numeracy. Not worrying so much about, say, a right-wing perspective has often been said, educate the best, forget the rest. From a societal point of view, they would say, well, really, it's those people who are going to be the major movers in society. I think it's a matter of values, but that's not my values because I think even intellectually, you're losing intellectual capital of society that way. If you did that, if you only put your money into the best kids. Francis Galton, who started behavioral genetics in the late 1800s, a cousin of Darwin, he said, ability will out. Meaning, if you've seen musically gifted kids or mathematically gifted kids, you don't have to give them the best tutors in the world or music teachers. It's almost like you just stay out of their way and they're going to develop their musical skills, especially nowadays with Spotify and all of that and the math programs that kids can get. So I think the Finnish model is an interesting model where you say what's important is to make sure everybody gets minimal levels of literacy and numeracy so that they can participate in society. Because with increasingly technological societies, you need those sorts of skills just to be participant.
I see your point. Still, when we're recording this podcast, we're in the middle of a Tour de France. I don't know if you're familiar a bit with that.
Yeah.
Yesterday there was this étape, right? This step. I don't know.
I know what you mean. Stage, yeah.
Stage. And it was called le contre-la-montre, right? So it's you just go one by one. And this guy, Jonas Vingegaard, he blew like everyone else. Like he was 1 minute 38 seconds.
Whoa, I didn't hear about this.
Tadej Pogacar, who's like they're both of them. They're like, and the second one was himself another minute above. I mean, before faster than the one behind, right? Which is already very, very good. And so I read that and I was like, oh my God, this is insane. How can they do that? And then the first articles you read are like, yeah, it's amazing. It's wonderful. And I was like thinking, at some point someone is going to say it. So this morning it came and they said, I mean, this guy must take some drugs. I mean, this cannot happen. And obviously the defense was that the whole training, the whole knowledge we have about their body, I don't know if it's their DNA, but themselves, the whole training sessions, the whole food. I mean, they just said these guys, they don't have like one day of, recreation a year. Like even in December when they don't, I mean, they don't have, I mean, they will have one cup of champagne and that's it. I mean, that is the best day of their year, right? I don't know. So what I'm saying is that when I hear you saying if you get this gifted kid on music, piano, whatever it is, you let him just be a pianist and he will listen on Spotify, learn by himself. I mean, maybe Einstein became Einstein because he had all of these predestination. Can you say that?
Yeah.
Or, to become Einstein, but he also had a lot of good professors, a lot of curiosity and nature versus nurture. I mean,
but he didn't really have the good professors, right? He was working in a clerical job in the patent office.
Okay,
when he developed a lot of his stuff, and there's a lot of examples like that where mathematics genius came from India in a rural family with no education.
Do you say that, for example, you cannot compare the mind with the body in the sports area? It's not that true. I mean, training.
No, I think it's very true in sports that mostly it's genetic, and anyone can be better. Like if you decided you wanted your kid to be a marathon runner, you could help her, encourage her, get her into those clubs. But she's not stupid, so she'd realize actually, first, she doesn't like running. Second, she's just not very good at it. And she could get better at it. But in contrast now, if you take kids who, you can see from a very early age which kids are athletically gifted, like in most sports, coordination, hand-eye coordination. We just had Wimbledon and you could see, I mean, Djokovic at age 3 knew, he wasn't from a tennis family, but he knew he wanted to play tennis. And the club opened up. A coach said, wow, this kid is just 4 or 5 years old and he's so good. And, so you need that material. But then if he had just said, well, I'm good here, I don't have to work at it. But he works at it just like you described those bicyclists. He's at it all the time.
By himself. I mean, the fact that Cristiano Ronaldo was famous for doing like 3,000 sit-ups a day or and stuff like this, I mean, made him better. But what you say, it's not, the training is important, but it's not because he hang out with better people.
And everybody in athletics knows that. I mean, you said at the beginning that you accept in sports, not everyone is going to be an Olympic champion, an elite athlete at running or at any sport particularly. You can be very good, but if you don't have the raw material to build on, you're just not going to be competitive. So it's difficult for people to get their head around. It's not to say you can't do anything. You can make your kids better. If you wanted your kid to be a basketball star and they're short, you could actually make them pretty good. They could be a guard. They could be pretty good. They're never going to be professional level athletes. And similarly, I had a friend, Nick Tchaikov, who was actually a Tchaikov, and he ran the youth orchestra in London. And their goal was to bring kids from poor backgrounds who don't have any musical experience and to give them a summer of musical training. And he would say he could take any kid, tone deaf, whatever, and make them into a pretty good musician. And if they had some basic, sort of musical sense, he could probably make them good enough to be able to earn a living at it. But they definitely wouldn't become concert pianists or top-level musicians, and they know it themselves. They look at these other kids who
it yourself.
Practice less than they do and are just streaming ahead. It was one of the mistakes I made with my kids. I had these boys I was raising, and they maybe inherited orneriness from me. But I thought to be a cultured person, you have to be able to read music. You don't have to be a good musician. But I felt they didn't teach it at school, so I thought, no, they had to have piano lessons and just learn to read music. And they said, right, that's what you like. They didn't want to do it. So this became a huge battle between us. And they're both like music. They listen to music, but they're not good at music. They still don't play instruments. And they know that their friends at the same time were composing music, not because they had music teachers, just because they were really good at music. So kids aren't dumb. They can see what they're good at, what they like to do. And just because their parents want them to do something is probably not enough motivation to put in the, 10,000 hours idea of expertise. There's only so many 10,000 hours in your life growing up. And, you can't, as you were saying about the cyclists, that's their whole life. There was a series of 3 films by Robert Redford on winning in America and what it takes to be a champion. And one of them, terrific film, Downhill Racer, was about how you have to give up everything in your life to be the best. You can be great. I enjoy downhill skiing. I'm not going to be a racer because, that's just such a high level of skill and dedication.
So DNA is not enough. That's what
DNA is not enough, but it's not enough not to have the DNA. Do you know?
Yeah.
You can only go so far without it. And at that top level, we're talking about not just raw ability. It's not just motor ability, say with downhill racing or something like that, or all of these things. There's a huge psychological component to it. Motivation, grit, perseverance, willing to sacrifice the rest of your life. That was the point of this trilogy of films by Robert Redford on winning in America.
Yeah, you have to go all in for those things, even if you're predestined, even if you're
good at it.
Yeah,
there's a lot of other people who are good at it. Like I used to play a lot of squash, and I was state rated in Colorado, and I don't know if you know squash at all, but there's this famous family, Khan family in Pakistan, who just ruled the squash world. Well, the old man Khan came to Colorado, Denver. They paid him a huge amount of money just to be the coach and to highlight the squash in America. And so I took a lesson with him. He's a fat old man who looks like a bald Buddha. I could hardly get a point off of him. He just knows where the ball is. And he'd say things, Buddhist-like things like, too much air around ball. You sort of know, you're not hitting it in the sweet spot.
Fuck off.
but just goes to show you at the higher levels, the expertise, the elite athletes, they just spread out, like you were saying. So even this guy who won by a minute and a half that you were talking about, in the Tour de France, maybe drugs is not a bad bet because we know that cycling was really riddled with drugs. But there are big differences between people. And it's interesting that those guys often are just good at one stage. That guy might not be so good at the mountain stage, for example.
Yeah, actually, this one is good everywhere. So that's where they raise the drug problem, probably. Right. What is kind of surprising, or the question I could raise... I've played ice hockey for a long time, and I was a big fan of Chicago Bulls.
All right, that's where I grew up.
Yeah, I know. That's why I say that. With the Iroquois, is it the
Iroquois?
Iroquois, yeah. I've seen those guys that were better than I was when I was a kid, but I didn't end up being. I ended up being a professional for a year in a Series B. Very small team in France, which is not a hockey nation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so I didn't end up being a international amazing guy. So I get your point. But I've seen those guys who were, I believe, as you say, we all saw them at some point in some sport, some area. They were naturally better than I was. But I've seen also that after year after year after year, I could,
get better
than them actually, or probably because they were not working as much as I did. That's probably the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going. I've seen there are some. I'm thinking about Matthieu in France, or a soccer player, or you probably don't know, or even Olivier Giroud. Maybe you've heard of because he played in England.
Yeah.
But they're famous because they were late in their eclosion, right? They came late into the sport, and they became very good very late. So. I believe, I don't know if it's exception or just they didn't have the right training, or I don't know.
I don't know. No.
The other question I have, or remark, I would say is, so how important is hanging out with us here on this podcast or with my other guests that are my ideas? I will go hang out with the best people in their area and understand their area and how they came up being the best, right? So we are the average of the people we hang out with. If I hang out with the best people in their area, I will on average, I'll get better, right?
Could be genetic.
But I mean, do you think people should stop listening to my podcast because this is not true? Do you think they would get anyway some good inspiration? And do you think that's a good thing. I'm trying to get your thoughts before you tell them. Maybe you think if they're able to listen for 3 hours of those stuff, that they're already their DNA is already good enough they're curious, they have those skills. I don't know, what's your analysis on this?
Well, I would think people listen to podcasts like this because it's interesting, it's fun, we can disagree agreeably, and maybe that's getting better in the sense they learn stuff. Like, I bet a lot of people, I hope they at least consider the possibility that genetics is a very important part of understanding who they are and who their children are. And if, then they can go away and think about it instead of, say, blaming their parents and a poor upbringing for why they're depressed. You can always look back on your life and say, oh, when I was young, my mother did this to me, and, maybe, but it's more likely to be genetic, and doesn't mean you can't do anything about it, but it is part of understanding yourself. So if you're a depressive sort of person, there are things you can do about that, like mindfulness training. A lot of it is about that. It's just sort of like healthy thinking. You don't ruminate about stuff, so there are things you can do, but it sort of starts with understanding who you are. And for me, for example, there's this thing about, genetics gets more important as you get older, which is contrary to what people might think. You might think, well, no, more environmental stuff happens. But actually, genetics gets more important as you get older. And maybe when you get older, you'll have this experience too. I hear it from a lot of people, that the older you get, the more you realize you're like your parents because they were older when you were growing up. And
and most of the time, it's not the good part of your parents
exactly
you're thinking
of. That's interesting, isn't it? You don't see the nice things you liked about your parents. So with my father, the one thing, is great. I had great parents, loving parents, but my father was very quick-tempered, and he would go from being he was like a terrible road rage person. Someone cuts him off and gets really angry, and you say, "Whoa, that's something that I'm not going to be when I get older." But now as I get older, I find I do have that tendency. And so what do I do about it? I don't say, oh, well, that means I just fly off the handle. No, it's the contrary again. It means I do this mindfulness thing where you're aware of your anger. It is just a feeling, a thought. It's just neurological stimulation. And if you can catch it in the first second or two, you don't have to be angry. And and I can say, this guy cuts me off in the car. I feel that flash of anger. But what good is that? He's probably a moron anyway. And what do I care if he's gotten ahead of me. And so I can just, not be angry. And that's a tremendous gift. But it's only because I recognize that I've got this tendency towards quick-tempered, anger, and to realize that's not good for me. Because if I get angry, I'm angry for a while. It's not like some people, angry this second.
I know. It
stays with you for a while. And it ruins some of your life, What's the point of that?
And you're happy at that moment that you don't live in Texas anymore. Because you would probably have a gun in your pocket and shoot the guy,
well,
right?
There is that,
If you see those fields you've been studying, you know what? Actually, it's a question we Clémence here brought up with herself, her brilliant mind, and ChatGPT, but I think it's interesting. Actually, I'll read it exactly how it came up. Looking forward, where do you see the field of behavioral genetics heading? What are some questions that you think the next generation of researchers should be asking?
Well, that's got to be DNA and the DNA revolution. And everybody will have their DNA sequence. And so we'll need to work out what people do with that information. But it's already all done in terms of single gene disorders. We can now genotype thousands of them. And as I said, we could tell if someone you're going to have children with has some of those matched recessive mutations that will definitely cause a disease, a genetic disease in your children. Very rare, but as I said, on average, we're talking 5% maybe. And if you can eliminate that totally at low cost,
5% is huge. Yeah.
And imagine if you could eliminate these recessive disorders. They cost trillions of dollars, cause huge upset. Having a child with one of these terrible genetic diseases is the worst thing you could wish on somebody, So I think that we will all have DNA sequence. It remains to be seen how much of that we get ourselves. But because it's available privately, increasingly people will have it, that information. And parents will be saying things like, we could all say, instead of general medicine where, you're given a prescription based on your weight and gender at best, but you might respond positively to a drug, I might respond negatively. Like some basic drugs like Tylenol, they can kill some people, a very small number of people. But if you could predict that, you would say, well, don't give them Tylenol. Any intervention is going to be bad for some people. And the one I'm particularly concerned about, I don't know where it is in France, but in the States, 10% of kids are diagnosed as ADHD, hyperactive. Yeah. It's attention deficit disorder. And the majority of them are administered amphetamines, methylphenidate, Ritalin, as a cure. And, that's speed. And when I was in college, we knew what speed did. It gives you more attention, but it screws you up in lots of ways. It's not a nice drug. You can get paranoid after a while. Yeah. Kurt Vonnegut's son had a schizophrenic episode due to amphetamine psychosis. So if you could predict which kids will respond positively to a drug like the amphetamines you give people who have hyperactivity, or even more importantly, kids who will respond badly to it, that sort of information is going to make parents just demand to have this genomic data.
Interesting.
So I think without doubt what's happening is the DNA revolution is going to expand throughout society. And then you couple that with AI, and AI is going to change everything. And it will also make much more use of these DNA data.
It's going to happen tomorrow. That's
it's happening now.
Yeah, it's happening. Yeah.
When you say Alexa, or Siri, that's AI, isn't it? It's a low.
Take this voice when you talk to Alexa.
No, I'm Alexa.
Oh yeah, Alexa. Do you believe the whole education system should change?
Absolutely.
Like dramatically.
Dramatically, and to think even now, the typical classroom here in England is a teacher standing in front of the class of 30 students and giving them a lecture. And, half of the kids aren't going to understand what she's saying. Half of them are going to be bored with it. With computers, how can we do that? Like you think of math, these programs that you were mentioning earlier, they're so beautiful, like the CAHN, K-A-H-N programs, that they're personalized completely. They figure out how quickly you're learning something, and if you're not doing so well, they drop back. You don't just fail, you never fail. You just keep finding the level and go up. But if you're really good, you just can go as far and as fast as you want.
If you like it.
So why on earth are we teaching math the old way? Everybody, do your times table. How much is 4 times 8? It's just crazy to me. It doesn't put teachers out of business. It means that they should personalize the education even more.
Yeah.
Help the kids who are having problems. Because a lot of what the teachers do is behavior management. They're not teaching kids. They're just managing the kids who are hyperactive or, have
at the end of the day, you see, I've met people who were traveling with their kids and they were teaching in 2 hours a day or in 1.5 hours a day, whole program. Right. They were even going faster than the regular
I can believe it.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you, you said earlier on, if they're programmed to, or if your DNA is programmed that way, there are better chances that they like playing piano, for example, or whatever it is, Is that proven? I mean, if I'm predestined, can you say no?
You can't, because it's too deterministic. But if you can say they have a propensity, a tendency to be good at music or to like music, you can say that.
Because you see sometimes some kids like... I would see my son Eli. He looks very good with a ball within his feet, and I would be like, you should play soccer. Yeah, I mean, you seem to be quite good, and actually his sister plays very good soccer also. But he's like, no, not interested. He wants to play tennis, and he's not, I believe, that good at tennis. You know what I'm saying? It's sometimes maybe you just miss the spot. No, that happens.
Yeah, but if you think about your job as a parent, is giving them the opportunities to find out what they like to do. And sometimes they'll make a mistake. Maybe your son likes tennis because there's a pretty girl who's taking tennis or something like that. Or your daughter
several times.
Your older daughter didn't like math at 5, where she can't know if she likes math at that level. So, they make mistakes. But, if you give them enough opportunities, maybe they sort themselves out. But it's not determined. It doesn't mean they'll end up doing things that they like in life. It doesn't mean you'll marry people who are good for you or that you actually like, And maybe after a few marriages like me, you'll get it right or better. You don't marry crazy women. I learned that very early.
Yeah. Not you, at least. Some people are maybe made for that.
Maybe they find it exciting.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things are, divorce shows genetic influence. But again, divorce isn't something that happens to you. Obviously, that's a breakdown in a relationship. And relationships have a whole lot of you in it. So genetics can enter these relationships. But the biggest factor predicting of the genetic influence on divorce are things like this craziness, risk-taking. You could say joie de vivre, but it's more than that. It makes people interesting, do you know? But those same things probably are not very good for predicting long-term relationships.
Have you studied divorce? And
people have. And it does show genetic influence. And that's something that people say, well, how can that be genetic? But I think if you understand what I've been saying, you think, well, it's not unreasonable that there's some genetic influence on divorce. And you can show that in adoption studies, where kids are adopted away at birth from their biological parents. And whether their biologic parents get divorced is predictive of whether they get divorced. Their adoptive parents' divorce doesn't predict. these adopted kids, raised by those adoptive parents. So all these data together suggest genetics is important, and not just for physical things, but also for behavioral traits.
The interesting thing you're saying here about missing the spot is that you have to try many things in your life to also find your, at least the things maybe you're good at naturally, but where you will also find your, happiness or excellence, that is important.
Exactly right. And I think there's a lot of bad aspects to the gig economy that we go through now. But one good thing is that, just as you're saying, you can try out different things.
Yeah, many.
And find out, gosh, well, I really like doing that. I'm kind of good at that. And that's an ideal thing as compared to the old days, like Bruce Springsteen's song about, got married at 16, had a kid and got a job, and that's all she wrote. There are no lifelong jobs anymore. It used to be you go into a motor factory and, as your father did, and, that's it. That's your job for life.
That was for three generation at least, but before it was you would be in the fields probably from a father.
That's true. Yeah.
And are you ready for another 2 hours of podcast with the next question? Wait, no, I'm kidding.
I just need to know what time it is because I'm having dinner with my son.
We're done. I'm just. It's 20 to 7. It's 20.
Okay, I'm meeting him at 7:15.
Yeah. So we're almost done. But the next question I was about to ask was, what do you think about Sigmund Freud?
Well.
That's a 2 hours question. No, but the psychoanalysis and all of these things. Because I think we've been talking a lot of DNA, maybe a bit less of psychology, or the two mixed, but
But Freud isn't psychology. No one in psychology pays any attention to Freud anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
In France, for some reason, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapy is still a big thing.
Yeah. Very big.
And in New York it is, for some reason. But in the rest of the world, it's not. And in academia, the only place you see psychoanalytic theory is in English departments.
Okay.
English literature uses the Freudian symbology of anything longer than it is wide is a symbol of a penis, and anything that's a hole.
It's a posh thing, is it?
But you know what it is people like to do therapy in a way.
Yeah.
And with psychoanalytic therapy, it's not it's not effective. But what it is it's years and huge amounts of money for you to have a professional handholder, someone who makes you think about your life. And that's probably a good thing, but it's not going to fix your problems. If anything, I think it makes you think that your early childhood, that's what Freud is all about, breastfeeding, toilet training, the way your mother interacted with you in early life. There's no evidence that makes a difference. But Freudian theory will have you thinking about that, which is probably not a good thing, as opposed to many other psychological therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is focused on sort of the mindfulness, the healthy mind thing, which I think everybody ought to do. Because, we all ought to have healthier minds, and there are things we do that are bad for us, like I mentioned, rumination and focusing on the bad aspects of our life. And instead to kind of live more in the moment. And, the whole mindfulness thing, I think, is very good for people.
The ancient things are quite interesting, even though you're not a believer anymore. The capital sins, jealousy, or ruminate.
The cardinal sins, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Or if you take also what you say, like all of these ancient things from China, meditation, and all of those things are, back on stage, but for good reasons, I believe. I don't know.
But they don't mean you deny genetics.
Yeah.
In fact, you can actually use that. I'm not at all anxious. But if you were anxious, that mindfulness training can be very good for that, identify. Just like I was talking about anger, it's the same sort of thing. We can identify any of these feelings and not identify that they're not us. We're our mind and this consciousness. And those are just neural stimulation, just like we don't see, think, or hear anything. Our brain's in a box. This is the new neural theory of consciousness, which I think is amazing, that you don't see this cup. What you're doing, your brain is in a box. It's just getting the photons that hit your eye, and that neural stimulation is combining with the neural stimulation from all over your body to create an image. So this wonderful book, the best book I've read in a while, is called Being You by Anil Seth, Anilseth. And he's a neuroscientist who studies consciousness at Sussex in southern England. And it describes this new neural approach to consciousness. And the basic, it ends up by saying, we're not perceiving anything. We're creating these images, like creating a movie. And he says perception is controlled hallucination, in the sense that you don't see this. You're creating this image, and the color doesn't exist. It's just that your eyes can interpret it that way. Other species, wouldn't be able to see it at all the same way. Bats, would only see a sonar pattern here. So it's really a remarkable way of thinking about consciousness, and making it not this mystical thing from Far Eastern philosophies, but making it, really kind of an empirical, useful way of thinking about who you are, which is why his book is called Being You.
I could spend hours talking with you, Robert, about this, about also, the attention economy, the problems we have of being always stimulated, and that where we need actually all of these things, because we're not made for that, probably. That's my belief, but I could spend hours or ask you a lot of questions about drugs and what you think about all of, different kind of drugs, but the proper drugs you buy in pharmacy, but also how you treat all of those things. But I guess I took you enough time.
It's just been terrific talking about this. I can't believe 2.5 hours has gone by already.
Couple of questions. Where do I follow you? Is it on LinkedIn, Twitter? Can I send you an email? People who are listening.
I respond to email. I don't do social media. I have social media accounts, but my students sort of do those for me. And but I'm easy to find. If you just Google Robert Plomin, I have about 30 podcasts on YouTube. So.
Do you do, if people call you from France or everywhere in the world who listen, do you go for conferences, or do you do those kind of things? Yeah.
I do conferences a lot less, because during the pandemic, we learned that you don't really need to go to these places. I like to go to conferences just to feel part of a community. But what I realized I liked is the receptions. Where you just get to talk to people.
Champagne, no.
But actually getting to meet these people once every few years is about all you need, to kind of catch up with them, to feel you're part of a community. But I can do that other ways now. And the conferences themselves are not cost effective, from my point of view. Otherwise, they're good for my students and that sort of thing, because they need to.
What I'm saying is that if people pay you to come to Paris or wherever, you do that, or is it in your?
I tend not to. Unless I get paid a lot of money to do it, or
that's 20K.
Or interest. No, 10K.
Here we go.
I have an agent who does that, and mostly she talks people out of it. But partly it's because it's harder for me to travel. My wife is not well, so I have to arrange carers and that sort of thing. So it's and just from a personal point of view, I don't need that so much. I can have the personal contacts with people.
You'll send a lot of love to your wife from all of us.
Thank you.
Should I start? If I have never read a book from Robert Plomin, which one should I take first?
Well, I think Blueprint would be the way to go. And it's not a completely easy book, but I think it's definitely a book for the public. It's not an academic book, and
the listeners who are still here after 2 hours, half hour, are specifically smart, so they will be able to read that.
And persistent.
And persistent. So great. Buy this book, L'Architecte Invisible, in French, or if you want to read in English, it's going to be Blueprint. You can find it on the description of this podcast. Would you have one book to recommend? You've given one before, but one book you loved. If there would be one book you would recommend to everyone, which one would it be?
A novel or science?
Whatever you want. One book, the one that...
it's hard. I read so much now. I read the whole Booker list, and it's hard. you like books. It's like your children, you like them for different reasons. So I'm afraid I really can't answer that except for this book being used. So that counts for something I've read. And there's just so many books, but I'd have to say, well, I like this book because of that. And I like this book because of that. So can I pass on that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Robert Plomin, I was thrilled. I hope you liked it too.
I enjoyed it very much. It was really a great conversation because it was a conversation.
It was a conversation. Yeah. I was into it. I have one regret. You know what? Is that now I want to be tested, but I don't know how, where. I mean, as a French person, I didn't get that answer. Maybe I'll have to wait a couple of years. I don't know. Yeah. But I don't know if I have to go to 23 and me and get the data. And I'm a bit in a.
But you do get a lot of information out of 23andMe, and you get the ancestry stuff too, which does interest people. Sometimes it's surprising.
So it's okay to start with that.
And you hope you get boring results from 23andMe. That is, you don't have any of these rare single gene mutations.
You know what? I'll put the rest on ChatGPT, so then I'm sure that everybody will get all of my information. I don't know where on the cloud, but okay, great. Thank you very much.
Well, really nice talking to you.
Yeah.
Thanks for raising this, Clémence.
Yeah, thanks, Clémence. And thanks to ChatGPT. She hates me for saying that. That's a game we have, all right? If you're an English listener, English speaking, I was very happy to have you here also. I don't do that many podcasts in English. I have a couple of ones in the past. We'll put the links in the description of this episode. I'm thinking about Perry Chen from Kickstarter, I don't know, Michael Horvath from Strava, and a few others. And I hope you enjoyed it. And you know what? You should start French so you can listen to my podcast, and it's a good thing to spend 3 hours with me in French. You will learn French and a lot of things with great people at the same time. Big kiss to everyone, and see you next week or next time I publish an episode in English. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.